so much for having me. Thank you also for all the presenters who preceded us, who are going this afternoon, and for really setting the stage around inspiration. And I want to share what has been really inspiring me, and I realize in retrospect, these are practices that have been a big part of my life for some time. So I want to present some ideas that I'm framing around this topic of wonder and rigor. So, in large part, I've been working on this, what I call a working theory on optimizing creativity. I'm very interested in the way we can optimize creativity in the way individuals work, as well as in the way organizations are designed. And I think it's really important to optimize creativity so we can essentially span boundaries, so we can cross what's been previously divided. I think that's super important. And so what's inspired me in my life are three areas, all of which I've either delved into through practice, through work, or just through my family. And those three, I call them lenses. Those three lenses are fashion, jazz, and dance. And I'm going to go through each one. I'm going to really pay much more attention to the last one. I've been paying a lot of attention to dance. So fashion. So this is, I'm going to show you a couple of images from a runway show from an American designer, Byron Lars. And I'm especially interested in Byron Lars' work as a fashion designer because he is one of the few fashion designers who shows as models women who do not look like adolescent teenage boys. They look like full-figured women who used to be the image of beauty in, say, the 1950s. So for that, I really appreciate Byron, as well as just his beautiful clothing. But I gave a lot of thought to the ways that fashion are influencing a range of sectors. Started thinking about this about 6 years ago when I was starting my doctoral studies. Actually, almost 10 years ago now, excuse me. And I was interested in the way we see fashion influencing automotive, technology, food, and I was calling it, if you're familiar with Rogers' diffusion of innovation, I was interested in the way fashion diffuses through a lot of industries to influence. And so I ended up co-authoring a very academic paper about this with Johanna Blakely. And then we collaborated with Valerie Jacobs, who leads foresight and trend research for a branding company in Ohio. And I also tried to simplify what we were saying in one of my Inc.com blogs, because I blog for Inc.com. But here's the basic idea. The ways that fashion can be a source of inspiration for a range of industries are for 7 basic principles. This is kind of a heuristic that we put together. You can read these, but very simply put, fashion is excellent at anticipating the next, right? Because if it's too far in the past, it's costume. If it's too far in the future, we don't get it, we're afraid of it, we might not buy it. So the fashion industry is really good at that, and there's so many sectors that need to get excellent at anticipating the next. The other really great thing about fashion is that it delves into the street culture and subculture, as well as into the elite. So in that way, it's a great example of spanning boundaries. The second area for my inspiration is jazz. So I grew up in a family where I heard these musicians constantly. My father was a big, as we call it, jazz head. That's a slang expression for someone who's a devotee of jazz music. And interestingly, I ended up coming full circle and borrowed from a lot of theoretical research on jazz improvisation when I was studying the way the Ritz-Carlton Hotel designs experiential services. So talk about spanning boundaries, connecting the dots between seemingly disparate areas to make something very innovative. And I borrowed from a heuristic by Frank Barrett, and I refer to them as Barrett's 7. So Frank Barrett is a jazz musician. He's also an academic, and he said these are 7 basic ways that organizations that are improvisational organizations are also borrowing from the behaviors of jazz. So not only the way I used this heuristic is I applied it to understand the way this hotel was designing experiential services for guests. So in jazz music, for example, you provoke competence. In jazz, there's no such thing as a mistake, right? There's only the build. There are minimal structures in the composition. So the musicians know music theory, they have a basic chord progression, there's a key that the song is played in, but what happens in the middle is the magic. There's hanging out, there's such importance in the way we design our spaces, as Veronique was talking about earlier, so that there's opportunity to have casual stickiness and to see what happens. So I applied these 7 principles, but what I really walked away with is the sense that we don't really understand what creativity is. Because I think if we really understood what creativity was, we would hear it much more talked about in our corporate boardrooms. We would have it be much more a part of the way we teach science and entrepreneurship. So creativity is actually a chaotic system. And I'll explain what a chaord is in a minute. I learned what chaotic systems are when I was learning about jazz as an improvisational system. So the word chaord is a made-up word. It's a word that combines 2 other words, chaos and order. And it was made up by this gentleman, D. Hock. So chaos is not anarchy, it's randomness. And order is not control, order is boundary and structure. So what we get in between, the opportunity is to have a flow between chaos and order. And so D. Hock is this gentleman right here. He was the founder of Visa, the credit card company. And when he was tasked with founding Visa, he was working in financial services, he kept getting promoted. He was a big naturalist. He loved taking time to walk in the woods, and he thought, gosh, I have to think of this huge global company that has this electronic transfer of currency. Why do we make our human organizations look like a linear progression of boxes and arrows? When I look around me in nature, and the way a new forest sprouts up is that a seed drops from the tree, it forms a sapling from the forest ground. It's very emergent, adaptive. If I skin my elbow, there's not a train of permission slips that goes up to my brain and says, okay, now you can start to heal, right? There's localized, emergent, self-organizing systems in place. So he thought, how can we make our human organizations designed in such a way where they have this nice ebb and flow and blend of chaos and order? So it turns out that in nature we see chaotic systems. In the human body we're constantly seeing chaotic systems. Jazz is a chaotic system rooted in complexity theory. So I went on from there and I started thinking a lot more about, okay, so if creativity is a system, how do I think it makes sense to think about this system? Because I work a lot with companies, and my clients are always trying to figure out how can we optimize the way we work in a way that, the big I word, the way that innovates for our own clients. And I suspect that they really need to get grounded in creativity, but what do I mean by that? So this is a working model, and creativity is grounded in curiosity. Curiosity is a non-starter. Without curiosity, we go nowhere. We have to begin with just the intention to ask questions and to learn how to frame better questions. And then building on the work I did with the Ritz-Carlton and jazz, the jazz heuristic for improvisational systems, I said, well, improvisation has to be a really fluid part of the way we were creative in this whole chaotic system principle. And around that time when I was developing this, I had gotten really curious about intuition. Because I believe that intuition is actually a tool for strategy. I got curious about intuition because I was observing that when you would interview entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs would tell their story about how they got started, there's always this moment when an entrepreneur would say, something told me not to do the deal. Or, something told me to work with her and not him, even though her pedigree wasn't as elite. And I thought, well, what is that something? And I believe that something is intuition, which fundamentally, intuition is pattern recognition. It's that nudge, it's that feeling that I've seen this before, I've felt this before, and there's that leap to go with it. And there's an ebb and flow between improvisation, intuition, grounded in curiosity that gets us finally to the insight or impact. So let's delve a little bit more into intuition. Intuition is a muscle. It's a radar. The more we use it, the stronger it gets. The less we pay attention to it, the more flaccid and floppier it gets. And there's been a lot written about the role of intuition in strategy. There's been some written about the role of intuition in strategy. So for example, William Dugan, who's a business school professor at Columbia University, he's written a book called Strategic Intuition. He breaks it down to 3 different types of intuition. Einstein was a huge proponent of intuition. In fact, Albert Einstein called intuition a sacred gift. Steve Jobs also had deep appreciation for intuition, and he said that in his opinion, intuition was even more powerful than our intellect. And then of course, if you know something about American history, this woman, Harriet Tubman, was responsible for liberating hundreds of enslaved African Americans, and she relied on her dreams as a way to recall and remember maps and pathways for freedom. So intuitive leadership, I said, okay, I'm an ethnographer, I'm a qualitative researcher. How can I study intuition and intuitive leadership from an anthropological perspective? And I said, what if I could develop an ethnography of intuitive leadership? And I thought to start, I just started brainstorming job categories where I think people need to really use their intuition. And I thought about chefs, right, because they're really working on the call in the moment. DJs, I'm a former dancer, so DJs have to move the crowd, right? Choreographers and dancers in general, and then game designers. And because of what was accessible to me first and more immediately, I focused on the dancer choreographer to understand intuitive leadership. And so here's where I am at this, because remember at the beginning of my talk, I said this is a working theory on optimizing creativity. So I'm going to unpack the role of the dancer choreographer a bit. So I talked about fashion, talked about jazz, now a bit more about dance. So where I'm at is, I said, if we might think about the dancer choreographer as a systems designer, because the choreographer has to have this ability to do the following 3 things. They have to be incredibly integrative in their approach. They have to have this ability to zoom in and zoom out in a work process. And they have to do something, and I learned this from math teachers, elementary school math teachers. They have to be really good at productive grappling. So what do I mean by those 3 things? Well, the way dancers problem solve in the integrative level is they're totally tapping into, obviously, their body as an instrument and tool, but also their mind. Before the physical discipline comes intensive mental discipline and spirit. They don't leave that out. There's always this interplay and flow between the solo artist and then the group work. And then some of you may be familiar with service design. Service designers have actually pulled in a form of language that comes from dancer choreographers called Labanitation. So Rudy Laban in the 19-teens devised a way to record dance. So if you think about it, in the 19-teens, there were no video cameras, right? It's one of the hardest art forms to record in terms of tempo and momentum and depth perception. If you just have a still photograph, you're not really capturing the dance. So Labanitation has also been used, for example, in studies of healthcare context to understand the queue and the rushing congestion of people, for example, at a nurse's station. Zooming in and out is really important because it helps to give us perspective. And in a lot of ways, I then made the leap and said, dancer choreographers are cartographers. They have to have an ability to see and understand the landscape. And then this third principle, productive grappling. So if you remember when you were a little kid, if you were lucky in a math class and you got stuck on a problem, you had a teacher who let you take some steps back, go a bit sideways, and work your way in and out of the problem, doing productive grappling. So this is actually a term that, at least in the United States, secondary level, elementary school level math teachers are using. I thought, wow, I love that term. That's also what I see being done in the dancer's environment. So in the dance studio model, you're learning not just from the teacher, but from your peers. And you're learning all types of ways, fundamentally, how to see. When you learn to study dance, as most of the arts, you're really learning a new way of seeing. There's also this important role of movement and kinesthetic learning. So you're moving in order to learn. And I don't have a scientific research backing this, but I really think there's something to this idea of kinesthetics and movement. And I wish there was a way we could incorporate more movement into our work. So if we think of dancers as systems designers, and that's the way I've been thinking of them, I think there's a huge amount that organizations totally unrelated to dance can borrow from. So here's my wonder rigor model. And in short, what I'm really saying is that the way dancers approach problem solving is really valuable because they are grounded in a future-oriented growth mindset. They have a very integrative approach, not only emphasizing rigor and the discipline that is obvious in dance, but also wonder. And there's a focus highlighted by collaboration and perspective, and it's essentially, bringing back full circle, it's a chaotic system. So if we recall chaos and order, this chaotic system, we see creativity is a chaotic system, improvisation is a chaotic system. Once you start learning about chaotic systems, you're going to see them everywhere. It's really cool, I think. Similarly, wonder and rigor are these chaotic systems, and I think the intersection of wonder and rigor is what I call sentient intelligence. So this is the intelligence that dancers have that highlights their capacity for creative problem solving. So what's wonder? Well, wonder is everything from being given permission to suppose, to daydream, to pretend, to play. You know, when you're learning a new dance, you're actually learning a story, right? And you have to pretend you're in this different era, this different place, this different gender, this different culture in order to compellingly tell the story. There's a lot of curiosity, a lot of dreaming. Rigor, on the other hand, is tenacity, it's discipline, it's practice, it's time on task, it's meticulous, and it's thorough. And what's fascinating to me is that dancers don't throw out one for the other. They become really excellent at integrating them. I think this is a really important thing to learn. So no business school professor is worth her salt without developing a 2x2. So I played around with what a 2x2 might look like if we had on the x-axis scaling to rigor and on the y vertical axis scaling wonder. So if we're talking about organizations that have a little bit of wonder but a lot of rigor, they might be technically correct, but uninspired, right? Really great quality control, but they may be laggards in the marketplace. If we think about organizations that have a little bit of rigor, a little bit of wonder, they're basically ineffective, they become kind of boring, they're uninspired, uninspiring, they're flaccid. If we think about organizations that have a little bit of rigor and high amounts of wonder, that's not quite hitting the mark either because they may not be taken too seriously. They're a little loosey-goosey. I don't know what the translation is in French for loosey-goosey. It rarely manifests as something really solid for the end user. But here's really where I think we want to be working towards, high wonder and high rigor, right? Where it makes sense and it feels right. And it's actually spectacular, and you feel it here. It makes sense, mind and body, right? And there's a nice impact fit, and that actually is where we get to the z-axis, or value. I might even say appetite for risk. So this wonder rigor model can also, you know, when I showed the heuristic looking at, when I showed this slide earlier, integrative, zooming in and out, productive grappling, another way of thinking about that is to think about it in terms of play, practice, and perspective. There's a spatial and a temporal dimension to this. So when I think about my next steps and what's been inspiring me about wonder and rigor is I've been visiting with some dance companies and I want to observe a lot more rehearsals to really play this out. But I also have started testing this model with real companies. And I want to understand what's useful about the wonder rigor model. Is it useful as a self-diagnostic tool in an organization? Where in their workday do they experience more wonder, where do they experience more rigor or less rigor? What does that tell them about what they need to up the ante? And so that's what I'm working towards. And if any of you are part of companies and be part of this research, please let me know. And I'll end by saying, in my view, wonder trumps technique in a saturated market, says me. Thank you very much.